So mastering, quite a popular topic amongst producers, and a pretty good one too, because mastering is an art in itself. With so many different styles of music out there, there really is no correct way to master. So I'm going to take you through my approach in when I master songs and give you a little insight on what knowledge I've acquired over the years of experimentation and research. Now, ultimately, mastering cannot fix a bad mix. So you want to get your mixes sounding as good, as close as possible to the final product as you can. The perfect mix does not need any mastering, but that's the ultimate dream for all producers. So let's take a little demo on what this mastering session sounds like before and after the mastering. This song's called Origins by Zula Shanty, and you can check out the song in the description below. I'll put a link there. But let's see what this sounds like. So the plugin I use to master this song is called Izotope Ozone. Now, don't panic if you don't have this plugin, because you can accomplish most of what Izotope can accomplish with stock plugins. Hey, take a look at my friend Steve James, for example. He masters his songs with mostly Ableton plugins, and he still gets amazingly good sounding tracks. But as we go along, I'll show you the differences between the two so you can adapt it to your own situation. The first thing we want to do before we do anything is we want to loop the part of our track that has the most going on in it, so quote unquote the drop per se. In this particular song, I know that's going on between these 2 points, so we're just going to loop this right here. Now the first part of mastering we're going to look at is the equalizer. If your equalizer doesn't have a spectral analyzer on it, you want to throw that on there as well, because you're going to want to be able to look at the spectrum. If you're using Ableton 8, you can use this spectrum effect right here for that. In this part, you ultimately want to use your ears to know where to make your tweaks here, but you can also take a look at the spectrum and try and tweak it that way, though I don't really recommend it. But in this particular instance, Zula Shanty mixed this song pretty well, so I didn't have to do that many tweaks, which is ultimately ideal for someone who's trying to master. The only things I did was I rolled off the low end to make sure unaudible frequencies below 20 Hz couldn't be heard. This point's around 30 Hz. And I rolled off the top end too at 20,000 Hz, because again, anything above 20,000 Hz is inaudible to the human ear. So rolling off those 2 frequencies can help you bring up the volume of your track. The other point I did is I pulled a little bit down in between 300 and 500 Hertz, because a lot of the muddiness in tracks usually lies in this frequency. So I pulled that down and it made the mix sound a little clearer. So before and after this EQ is applied, here's how it sounds. Very small differences, so you may only be able to hear the differences on some good speakers. Next up is reverb. Although I didn't use reverb in this particular master, and reason being because Zula Shanty actually used enough reverb in his song that I didn't really feel that it needed it. But if you do feel your mix does need some reverb, it can give your mix kind of an overall sheen to it, but I only recommend applying reverb to the higher ranges, say about 7,000 hertz or so. And then everything else is depending on what your tastes are. I usually only keep the wet only slightly higher, but not much. But overall, I don't actually use that much, so let's move on. The harmonic exciter, I don't actually use that much either, but sometimes the mix needs a little bit more brightness to it. And what the harmonic exciter does is it adds a little bit distortion to whatever band you want to give it a little bit more brightness or distortion in that area. So whenever I do use the exciter, I only am putting a little bit on the higher frequencies and a little bit on the upper mid-range frequencies, but ultimately I don't like to use it because my mixes are usually bright enough, in my opinion at least. But if you think your mix needs a little bit more brightness, by all means go for it. If you want to have reverb or harmonic excitement and don't have ozone, you can easily do that with stock plugins. You can either use reverb. In Ableton, you could either use a standard reverb, and you can, let's drag this in here. Oop. And you can select the input processing to be a low cut. Turn low cut off, and drag this up so that you're hitting that same frequency range that I was talking about earlier. Just gotta adjust that, and then everything else following. If you want to do some excitement, you can find the overdrive effect right here, and look for enhance. This preset does the exact same thing. It applies a little bit distortion to the upper frequency range. If you want distortion in your lower frequency ranges, which I don't actually recommend, you can drag this little guy and open it up some more. But ultimately, I recommend to just sticking with the high frequencies. Now, time for everyone's second most favorite part, compression. Do you even compress, mate? For those of you who get that reference. But anyway, when it comes to compressing your mix, you want to use multiband dynamics or multiband compressors because there's a lot of frequencies going on in your songs that you need to be able to isolate each band, as you see here, 1 band, 2 band, 3 bands, 4 bands, in order to process them differently, because every single part of the spectrum has different characteristics. So if you were to just use one compressor, the first part of the frequency spectrum it would grab is the low frequencies because they're the biggest frequencies, they're standing out more. So it's better to go band by band with this one. So in short, a compressor is an automated volume modulator, and you have a couple basic functions that control that. You have your ratio, which controls how much gain reduction is going to be applied to whatever threshold you set. You're going to have your attack time, which is going to determine how fast the compressor reacts to the audio it hears, and the release time, which is going to affect how fast the compressor is going to let off of the audio coming in. And then wherever you set your threshold is how steep of a dynamic change you want your compressor to do. So to better illustrate that, we can change the view and look at the compressor just band by band. And this chart will give you a better representation of the audio coming in as opposed to the audio coming out. The y-axis represents audio coming out, and then the x-axis represents audio going in. Other functions to the multiband dynamics is you have limiters. So if you want to limit a particular band, which I never do, you can do that. And if you need to gate a particular band to maybe help increase its dynamics, you can do that as well. But for now, we're going to keep it simple and just go with only the compressor function. So how you want to approach this is you want to solo each band by band and adjust your compressor settings accordingly. You can solo a band by clicking this button up here, and when it's blinking, the band is soloed. Now the settings will depend on what kind of characteristic you're trying to accomplish with that particular band. If you're trying to reduce the amount of dynamic power it has, say the punch, you want to have a faster attack time and a quicker release. Now I usually like, and if you want more of a transparent compression, which is what I like to do, you want to have a slower attack time and a faster release. Now there's no magic setting for this, so you really just got to play with it yourself. When it comes down to the ratio, I usually just put a light ratio around 2 to 1. But depending on how much compression you want is up to you. Now notice how as the bands go up, my attack time and release times decrease. That's because a lot of the snappiness happens in the higher range frequencies, and I wanted to pull those peaks down a little bit because this song is a little bit peak crazy. Almost forgot. You can actually choose the frequency range that each compressor is working on. Now there's no magic setting, so it's up to you. I usually like having them evenly spaced, but if you're lazy like me, you can just play your song, right click on here and click learn, and Ozone will choose those bands for you. Normally, I would go through each one of these bands and have you listen to each one, but I think this video is getting a little long, so we're just gonna do the whole thing at once. So notice these little red bars that come down here. That's the amount of gain reduction that each compressor is applying to each band. I usually like keeping the same gain reduction across each one, but make sure whatever your gain reduction ends up being, you want to make that up here on the gain parts. But other than that, that's multiband compression in a nutshell. Now, if you don't have Ozone, or you have Ableton, for example, you can use multiband dynamics. Let me pull that up here. Same thing, just 3 bands. Here are attack and release times right here. You can adjust them. And then if you hit the A button is above, that's where your compressor settings are. You can adjust your ratios and your thresholds through this control right here. There's your makeup gain or your output, or you can do it on the input side as well. And then you can adjust the frequency range that each is adjusted through these guys. So whatever is below this point will be affected by the low compressor. Same thing for here. Anything above that point will be done by the high compressor, and anything in between will be covered by the mid-range compressor. Okay, on to the next step. Stereo imaging. Stereo imaging allows you to tweak the stereo wideness of each band, of 4 different bands of your sound. Typically, you want your lower bands to be more narrow and you want your higher bands to be more wide. If you were to try and widen your lower frequencies, you would get phasing induced into your mixes, and then you get random volume dropouts, and it just doesn't sound right. So what I did on the first band is I pulled this down all the way. Now, when I played this, I like to look at this little meter right here, this +1 and -1 meter. This gives you a general idea of where and when phasing occurs. You want the little meter to be hovering in between this middle line and +1. That means that your mix is not phasing. And if it drops below, it is phasing a little bit. So when I was first playing with this track, it was dropping a little bit below this threshold. So in order to remedy that, I gradually took down the second band until that eventually stopped happening. And then to make the track sound even wider, and it actually helps with the fatness of the track, I boosted up the 2 highest bands. So let's take a listen how the stereo imager has an effect on the sound of the track. So you saw a little bit of phasing occurred there. That would be something I would have to go in and fix again later on. Or go back into the mix and then fix it there as well. Another way to tell if you have phasing occurring is you can turn this mono switch on and you can listen to your track in mono. If you hear random dropouts or volume modulations that don't sound like they need to be there, that's what's happening, is the phasing effect is causing that to happen. Now suppose you wanted to widen your track and you didn't have Ozone to do it. So how would we do that? What you can do is you can grab your equalizer from your stock plugins and turn on the mono stereo mode, or M/S. And make sure when you're editing, you click stereo. And then you can take this little dot, raise that up, and then you'll be increasing the stereo volume, only the stereo volume in that aspect. It'll make your track sound wider. And if you wanted to narrow certain bands, you can just lower that on the lower band. And then change the shape of your curve how you see fit. All right, post-equalization. This is important to make sure that none of your processing beforehand for mastering messed with the spectrum so that it offset the original shaping you did in the first one. So what I like to do is I like to click on the snapshots tab and take a snapshot of the waveform. What it does is it averages all the peaks of the waveform and slows down the waveform so you can get a better view of what the shape looks like. This is a good way to help you make your tweaks, but ultimately your ears are going to be the final say in what tweaks you're going to make. So let me show you how this works. You press start capture, then play your song. And there it gives you a nice curve. And this is the kind of curve you want to look for. Most commercial music has this nice slow curve that goes down all the way down here. If you wanted to accomplish that with stock plugins, you can whip up your spectrum analyzer and then just slow down the sample rate so that the curve actually slows down itself. Judging by this curve, it looks like I should take a little bit down on this part of the spectrum, but to my ears, it sounds okay, so I could leave it alone, or I could go back to the compressor and see if I could bring down some of those hi-hats a little bit to make it mesh together better. Now, on to everyone's favorite part, the maximizer. Making your track really loud. Or if you don't want a loud track, not so really loud. But essentially, the maximizer is a limiter, but it has some qualities to it that really help you push the volume of your mix. Over here are the different types of limiting modes. The IRC modes are smart limiting modes. I don't know exactly how they work, but I know the IRC 1, 2, 3 are just different levels of CPU usage. Obviously, the IRC 3 is going to use the most, and my computer can handle it, so that's the one I tend to use. If you wanted to use the hard mode, essentially what that means is that your song will not pass whatever margin you set it up here. If you were to use the soft mode means that it will pass it a little bit and will give you more of a smooth limiting effect. So you want to be careful of clipping if you're going to be using the soft mode. Intersample detection. I keep this on because it helps in a certain aspect. These limiters are digital limiters, and we're listening to a digital audio signal. And digital audio signals are not continuous. I won't go into detail of it, but if you were to play your song on an analog player or older stereo that is an analog player, the waveform is more continuous, and there might be some parts of your waveform that the limiter didn't actually catch and will go beyond the clipping range and end up sounding a little distorted on those players. I recommend looking into intersample clipping a little bit because it's an interesting topic to investigate. Over here we have the main controls of the limiter. You have your margin, which is going to set where you want your limiter to stop the sounds from getting any louder. And your threshold down here is going to determine how much limiting. The more you pull it down, the more limiting it's going to do. Every song I've mastered, I pulled this down a different amount. So it's something you want to play with to determine how much loudness you want to get. Over here on the character, this determines the kind of limiting that you want. If you want a crisper, a more clipping sound of limiting, pumping, balanced. It all depends on the song. If you drag this meter down more towards the fast part, you're going to get a louder limiting. If you move it towards the slower part, you're going to get a smoother limiting, but not as loud. If you're doing some harsh limiting, I recommend putting on the transient recovery. It's more of a transparent effect, but it'll help recover some of those transients you're smashing with your limiter. If you wanted to limit your stereo signal different from your mono signal, then you would turn the stereo link limiting on, and then moving this up and down will determine your dry or wet on that effect. Assuming you don't have any other plugins that are applying dithering, you can apply it here, and there's different modes to it. For those of you who don't know what dithering is, dithering adds a little bit of an undertone of noise to your tracks, so when you're encoding it down to MP3s, it'll help preserve the quality of the track. You only want to apply dithering once to your track, so make sure you're keeping track on where you actually apply it. DC offset filter, I always have this on because sometimes there's interference in our power cables and our power outlets. So the DC filter can help offset some of that interference and make the quality of your track sound a little better. I can't actually hear a difference, but I keep it on because I know it'll make a difference. And last but not least, sort of, I like to put another limiter on after the maximizer. And the limiter I typically use is the FabFilter Pro L. This limiter is absolutely amazing and I highly recommend it. But I put a limiter on to squeeze a little bit more volume out of the track because I really like it when my tracks are loud. But I don't do much limiting with this limiter, so you can actually use a stock limiter in your digital audio workstation and still get the same effect. I don't look for any more limiting past the -2 decibels mark. Any more would just destroy the mix. But let's turn this on and see how it sounds. So yeah, you can notice a little bit of an extra volume boost in that. One plugin I recommend, which isn't completely necessary, is the TT Dynamic Range Meter. This plugin can actually give you an idea on how loud your track sounds, because there's two different types of volumes. There's your peak volume, which is where your absolute highest peak of your waveform is. And then you have your apparent volume, which is usually measured in RMS value. So the higher your RMS value, the higher apparent volume a song will have. Of course, the higher your RMS value, the less dynamic your track is going to sound. So ultimately, you want to find a balance between the two. So let's run this through this plugin so you can get an idea how this works. Cool, so it's a pretty awesome plugin. I definitely recommend getting it. So there you have it. Take your track, take it into your car, take it to your headphones, to your friend's stereo, test it out there. Very rarely is my first version of my master the final version of the song that I'm going to release. It usually takes a few tries before I'm actually satisfied. So if you want to check out other examples of my mastering, you can head over to my SoundCloud. I'll put a link in the description below because I do master all my own tracks. Hopefully this was helpful and you learned a thing or two from this. So if you have any questions, hit the comments below and I get back to everyone who asks questions. But that's all I have. If you like this video, hit the like, subscribe because I'll be coming out with more tutorials in the future. But for now, peace out.